Okay, in several presentations to this august assembly, I've been exploring the parallel to the Nephilim myth, but as present within Egypt. I say parallel, perhaps I could even say one of the sources of the myth in the first place. So for this kind of short film, I'm returning to the theme of the giant, which is often overlooked theme in religious thought, Egyptian religious thought especially. I should say there's a famous question from UK former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, who always asks about what are the policy implications of a particular belief. In other words, what function does the myth of giants play within Egyptian magical practice and religious belief? Of course, it also draws upon the Greek translation or gloss of the term Nephilim as giant. And there is a passage within the book of Enoch which is, sort of underlines that idea, the translation gigantos as giant. Basically, giants, images of giants, are a fairly common thing to encounter within Egyptian books. When I say books, I mean normally people say papyrus, but really there's quite a lot of books within the Egyptian tradition. Things like the Book of Gates and the Book of the Amduat, what is in the Secret Chamber. These are kind of usually called the underworld books, which probably did exist in the papyrus form, in a book form, but were also then taken out and the images were drawn out on the walls of tombs and temples, usually tombs for the underworld books, as a guide, but I suppose you'd say also as a, not just for the dead anyway, for the living as well, as a reminder of the things that you're supposed to know, right? And they occur in a certain combination. Anyway, perhaps the most well known of the giant figures within the Egyptian tradition would be the Osirian giant. But there are other ones, like if you go to these giant tombs that you find in Saqqara, which are bull tombs from the Serapion. These are quite colossal, so you're getting this gigantic architecture in the first place. So there's that kind of aspect to it. You would also find that's one of the oldest statues that's ever been found in Egypt, and it's also giant, really, of the Colossus of Memnon, these giant figures. But apart from the fact of actual colossal figures with it in Egypt, the texts regularly show figures that are represented as being of a giant status and much bigger than the other figures around them. There's a good example from the nested golden shrines of Tutankhamun, which you can see in the Cairo Museum, probably in the new one now when it opens. And you have this figure of whose head is in the sky, if you like, surrounded by the Orbus, and his feet is in the place of destruction. And you can see how the other figures around it are actually on a much smaller scale. And that's not something that's deliberate. That's a process that's intentional. That's kind of sending a message. These things are in the text themselves are often called giants, and they have a particular role to play in the mythology as giants. There's a whole lot of them. Now, often these figures that I've mentioned, these texts, they occur in places that are designed for some sort of initiation. So it's not just tombs in the sense of the text itself specifically said this is for the living and the dead. So these places, the arrangement of these images and the connection with the giant is often connected with initiation of some sort into some sort of sect. not sect, either into being a scribe, which is a kind of semi-religious role, really, because you know that the scribe's work is basically connected with the sacred text, but also into the possibility of mystery traditions. This is a very interesting one. Also, a giant, kind of headless figure whose the sun is kind of taking over the head, has serpents for feet, but the text tells you this is a giant figure. Another giant figure would be specifically named as a giant. Is this one, the Lord of the Hours, and there's a particular moment of time in which transformation takes place. Not of necessarily the deceased transforming, or it's that. It's the individual undergoing the membership of a particular mystery cult within that, tradition, of which they do exist. That might have been disputed before, or a contested issue for some. There's another one, that the giant arms of the Nun. Again, you might just look at these things, and we're probably used to thinking, oh, it's just an artistic convention, but it is meant to be a giant figure, the giant figure that hold up the sun at the appropriate moment of dawn and all the rest. So it's a question of getting your eye in and recognizing that some of these things are intentional. It's not just kind of an accident that are depicted as giants. As I say, the famous Osirion at Abydos is in effect a symbolic giant's tomb. Well, because you couldn't actually bury a giant, they're not saying they actually have figures. Well, they do it at a sort of psychic level. But the whole thing is arranged on quite a colossal scale, much bigger than life scale. There's a kind of overview of it. And at one end, it's all underground as well, which is very, very significant in connection with the giants of Egypt, that they are kind of, there's this idea that there's this force that's submerged under the ground in the earth and has been there since primeval times. And one of the possible meanings of Nephilim is as the submerged ones, perhaps buried ones, or it might be what I head. So that's why it's significant that these things are in the earth. You have this whole structure, which we're looking at now, which is kind of underground, and at one end is actually a giant sarcophagus chamber, right? So it's shaped like a giant like a sarcophagus, but it's at huge scale. Obviously, it's difficult to see this in a partial sight, but it is there. At one end, behind that door, is a special chamber, and on the chamber on the walls of the chamber are all sorts of special texts which feature some of this giant figure that I've also mentioned. It's regularly mentioned. There's also a figure of the goddess Nuit, the star goddess, who again is another one of these giant figures within the Egyptian tradition. She's always depicted on this colossal form. In fact, the largest representations within the Egyptian tradition are of the particular goddess Nuit. And it's interesting that there are 4 basic texts that are depicted on the walls of the giant's sarcophagus chamber, including the Book of Earth and the Book of Nuit, and stuff to do with. There's a kind of depiction. It's very difficult to get a photograph of the actual image in situ because of the erosion on the site. So you have to rely on these kind of line drawings of it. But you can see there's a colossal figure of the goddess Nuit being held up by Shu and separated from the earth, which is Geb. And the text all across it is a kind of an astronomical calendar, basically a lunar calendar. There's several of them, in fact, 2, and one of them from a very, very archaic times. The other thing I kind of think is interesting to note is that, contrary to what people might think, they might have heard of the Osirion, but they might not be aware that there are actually quite a lot of these sort of structures dotted around within the Egyptian civilization. Obviously, for one reason or another, not a lot of them have survived, but several of them have. And it's quite likely that that they will find a few more. So this is from a place called Oxyrhynchus, which is an ancient city, which actually means the city of the long-nosed fish, which by a little bit of a stretch we could say that it's a city that one of its main connections is to the god Set, who's personified as a long-nosed fish, some sort of catfish, if you like. But other gods are kind of there, and they've been excavating this for the last 20 or 30 years, and they found mostly kind of what's above the surface, not very much now. It's just, there's obviously something there, but it's just sort of bare earth now. Most of the masonry has disappeared. But they have found a series of galleries or catacombs that have dug deep into the rock, with one or two different entrances taking you down. Again, you have this idea you have to go down into the earth. And it contains this prone statue, giant statue of Osiris. It's about 3 meters in length, in fact, and quite heavy. Perhaps its size and heaviness might account for the fact that it's still there, it's still in situ. It may well have been painted and all the rest. These sort of giant statues that are literally hidden, really. They're not like the colossal statues that are put there in plain sight. They're kind of buried in chambers underneath underneath the earth, in these kind of underground structures. And not many people would have known that they were there. So there's an idea that maybe people would have initiates of the mystery tradition, or those being initiated into the kind of sacred scribal tradition. At some point, they would be certain mysteries would be revealed to them. The statue would be one of them. If you imagine this in sort of semi-darkness, of all the kind of things that could go wrong with that, and this would be part of the mystery. This sort of extra burial of the giant, or the burial of the giant in the earth. This is a very Egyptian thing. So there's a very interesting connection with the god Set, and also with Osiris, and also with the hippo goddess as well, who's worshipped in the area. I say it all kind of adds to the idea that always within the Egyptian religious point of view would be this thought, this memory, this far memory of these giants, often broken up and sort of disassembled, that nevertheless parts of them were buried in under the earth, and the power of them can still be drawn upon in some way. And for us as well, knowing this, it kind of gives you an idea of how we sort of might draw upon those ideas in modern practice, in meditation and whatever, the sort of images that we might draw to mind. We think about the primary corpus of books, of underworld books that are arranged around us, that lay out the mysteries of the tradition, and we think about below us in the earth this buried ancient remnant of essentially the Nephilim within the Egyptian tradition, or they might have a different name. So that's Oxyrhynchus. The other, I said there were more than one of these. A good example of another one. I wanted to talk about another of these sites. This one, strictly speaking, isn't called an Osirion, although because there is actually another Osirion in the giant, in a colossal or immense ritual site that is Karnak, which is much bigger than, even if you visited the place, than you actually realise. All sorts of areas that are out of bounds. This is the old pet, which is a special spot not much visited, but the interesting thing about it, it also has a secret chamber, a secret underground structure. That's a ground plan of it, but there are a number of secret spaces underneath the crypts, if you like. And this is quite a function of late Egyptian temples, that they have these underground structures. I think they had them going back to Ramessid times, but certainly in the later times it's a much more obvious feature. Partly it provides a kind of underground protection of the sacred space itself. It provides this kind of corridor around it, but subterranean. But also buried deep within this crypt would have been another one of those statues that hasn't survived but is known to have existed. The reason why it didn't survive is because it's much more valuable a substance than the one I showed earlier from Oxyrhynchus. It would have been made of metal and gilded with gold as well. It was made of bronze, and all these things could easily be melted down and quite valuable to reuse. So it hasn't survived. Some bronze objects have survived, bronze statues from that period, which are quite interesting to look at. You can see that the Opet itself, this hidden chamber, is next to the small temple of Khonsu, the moon god, and there's probably a connection between them, because there's definitely a connecting doorway between both temples. And the doorway that comes out of the temple of Khonsu actually goes down into the crypt, so it is a way into the crypt. For a long time, people couldn't go down there, because there's been a persistent rumor. It's like a urban legend that it's got full of snakes and everything, which is interesting from an Egyptian point of view, that they would say there are all these snakes down there because snakes play such a role within the Egyptian underworld, all the rest. But they have now kind of renovated it, as far as I know, and they've been using some modern techniques, and they've actually managed to reveal lots of hidden texts which are to do with this mystery cult, with the mystery cult in the Egyptian tradition. And from that, they also know that buried in these underground chambers was one of these statues, as I say, a giant statue, a giant figure, which would have been awe-inspiring to people who were already in a kind of altered state, if you like, when they were sleeping in these chambers, which is one of the things they did as part of their training, spending quite a lot of time in a kind of dream state in the chamber, and being led around by various other higher adepts to see this mystery, including this giant awe-inspiring statue that existed there. So those are some of the things I wanted to talk about. It's a continual mystery, something that is being explored more and more even as I speak. The implications of it, this whole buried reality, there's obviously, I'm just touching the surface of it, or touching the underground of it. There's an awful lot of this stuff already exposed, this subterranean world of the Egyptians. But I thought I'd just give you a little lowdown on some of the stuff that I've been looking at.